Psychedelics are back. Woo! And what it takes is leadership. Thank you, Tom and Cherie, but it also takes a community. That would be you guys. Thank you. I want to talk about the language that we use, because the word psychedelic is the chosen word to describe the medicine that we are working with. And it was chosen intentionally. There are lots of other options. It could be psychomimetic, the first word that was used to describe these medicines in the 50s and 60s, that is like psychosis, hallucinogen, which means creating visions, or empathogen, which means increasing empathy, or entheogen, which means manifesting the spirit. But the first two, psychomimetic and hallucinogen, are negatively weighted. Empathogen and entheogen are positively weighted. Psychedelic is the most neutral term, and it's also the most accurate. And what it means is manifesting of the mind. And so it's a very consciously chosen word. It does have cultural baggage, the psychedelic 60s, but the bottom line is we're stealing the word back. We're reclaiming it. I said I would talk about the history of psychedelics. Well, it goes way back. The curandero's use of psilocybin mushrooms in Mexico, the Siberian shamanic use of Amanita muscaria mushrooms are just two examples of psychedelic communities. There are other examples. The Amazon use of ayahuasca in either shamanic or other traditions, the Huichol use of peyote, are all ancient traditions that resonate with psychedelics, where the psychedelic experience is woven into the very fabric of these communities. Now, the actual ritualistic structure that is used to contain the psychedelic experience in these different communities varies widely, but the function within the community is very similar. Psychedelics are used for healing. Everything from spiritual to physical to emotional to psychological issues. They're used for celebrating transitions, everything from puberty to seasonal changes. They're used to connect with cultures and families, and for exploring spirituality. If I was going to use one word to describe all of what I just said, indigenous use of psychedelics is pro-social. It's pro-social. It connects people to each other, to their families, to their communities, and their spirituality. Now, exploring history, there's some other interesting moments in history that have happened. There were two Nobel Prize winners that acknowledged that LSD played a role in their creativity. Francis Crick discovered the double helix of the DNA. Kary Mullis discovered the polymerase chain reaction. Now, I worked in the addiction services for many years. It is of interest to me that Bill W., who started AA, believed that LSD was incredibly useful. Here's a quote. "I'm certain that the LSD experience helped me very much. I find myself with a heightened color perception and appreciation of beauty, almost destroyed by my years of depression. The sensation that the partition between there and here has become very thin, constantly for me." And it's interesting, Terry Krebs, who's a researcher, went back and found a lot of the research that happened during the 50s and 60s, exploring how psychedelics can be beneficial for alcoholism, and observed, yes, in spite of the fact that many of these researchers didn't know what they were doing, they didn't know how to set people up appropriately, they didn't know how to work with setting, and context very skillfully, in the way current researchers do. But in spite of that, they demonstrated benefit when working with things like alcoholism. So it appears that Bill W. was right. So why did psychedelics get criminalized? If indigenous communities worked with psychedelics and embedded psychedelics within the fabric of their community in a pro-social way, what happened during the 60s was unprecedented. Psychedelics got linked to an anti-social message. It had never happened before. Tune in, turn on, and drop out was the message. And the cultural context of that had nothing to do with psychedelics. It was the Vietnam War. It was the baby boomers who were rebelling against the capitalistic norms of their parents. It was a rebellious generation, and the people with power did what often people with power do when faced with a challenge, is they criminalized the drugs of the people who are challenging them. So it was really about a significant process of cultural change. And there was a huge amount of propaganda that was associated with that process of the backlash against psychedelics. LSD fed ape, rapes, TV actress. LSD made me a prostitute. And my personal favorite, girl gives birth to frog. And doctors blame LSD. So it wasn't just that the drugs were criminalized, but the science was suppressed enough to actually say that the science was banned. So what other times in history have scientists not been able to report what they observe? Well, curiously enough, there is another example. In 1616, and for the subsequent 143 years, it was illegal to report what people saw through the lens of the telescope. Specifically, that the Earth was not the center of the universe. Dr. Stanislav Grof said, LSD is to the study of the mind what the telescope is to astronomy and what the microscope is to biology. Well, there is a psychedelic renaissance happening. The research is back. Now, it's interesting, I've been a drug policy reformer before I became a psychedelic advocate, and it's been very interesting watching for 30 years the media and how the media misrepresents drugs generally. And so it has been with great interest that I've observed the media has actually given this process a pretty fair shake. I'd like to give you some examples. I think when I first tuned into the impact of the media and how the media were talking about psychedelics in a constructive way was the New York Times article in 2010. Hallucinogens have doctors tuning in again. That was a moment in history for me when I realized that something was changing in terms of the media. The New York Times Magazine, how psychedelic drugs can help patients face death. 2012, New York Times, can mushrooms treat depression? 2015, psychedelic drugs may help treat mental disorder, says a study. Huffington Post, using psychedelics shouldn't be a crime. By our I mean Canadian, national newspapers, the Globe and Mail. Psychedelic drugs may be helpful in treating anxiety, addiction, and PTSD. Newsweek, psychedelics promise a paradigm shift in treating mental illness. The New Yorker, the science of the psychedelic renaissance. The impact of mycopollen is not to be taken lightly. I get 100 emails a day. And the number of emails that I get daily talking about, I read Michael Pollan's book, and they follow through with something. And it started with this one. Michael Pollan wrote this, the trip treatment for the New Yorker, and it was interesting because his editor didn't want to publish it the way it subsequently got published, and he said, you need to find a detractor, a challenger. And he suggested a couple of names. And Michael Pollan phoned these people up and said, would you comment on what I've just said? And he sent them the draft article. And the individuals who had been suggested as potential challengers declined to challenge him. So you'd think if there was one media, there was going to be the opposition. It would be Fox News. And you know something? Fox News has been favorable. It is outrageous to me to observe how Fox News reports on what we are doing. MDMA for PTSD, how ecstasy ingredient works in the brain, and it was positive. So psychedelic research has been legitimized in the media. If I'm showing one slide to academics, this is the slide I show.
The podium floats right there.
These are the universities that are producing significant papers looking at psychedelic research. In Canada, the conservative voice of medicine is the Canadian Medical Association Journal. This is mainstream. And so if I want to convince Canadian doctors that psychedelics are back, this is the image that I show them. Some other examples of academic journals. Analysis explores potential psychedelic treatments for mental illness. The Psychedelic Renaissance also is shown by Ben Sess's work. Ben Sess is a psychiatrist in the UK. Are psychedelic drugs seeing a comeback in psychiatry? My partner is a psychiatrist, and she looks me straight in the eye, and she says, what you are doing is going to transform her profession. Psychedelic healing. Hallucinogenic drugs which blew minds in the 60s may soon be used to treat mental illnesses. So I'd like to reflect on how researchers are thinking about psychedelics, because they break generally psychedelics down into three categories. There are the classical psychedelics, which are LSD, psilocybin, and what these classical psychedelics offer is a sense of spirituality. Now, it's interesting, it's generic spirituality. By that I mean Christians find the Christ, Buddhists find the Buddha, and atheists find the entire universe. So whatever your belief system is what is manifested for you. If you really believe in the vine, you'll find the snake in the vine. And that sense of spirituality is incredibly helpful in the treatment of many issues. There's a disorientation of the ego when fundamentally one's sense of self changes. And that's really useful for things like the treatment of alcoholism. Because if it's one's ego that is persuading one it's acceptable to drink 26 ounces of vodka every single night of your life, that belief system needs to be disoriented.
Oh, that's right. I saw that email. I was like,
And the classical psychedelics are really useful for that. They are unconscious amplifiers. They help us to access material in our unconscious minds. The permeability between the conscious and the unconscious mind becomes less. We can dig deeply into ourselves and find stuff. And if some of the issues in our unconscious mind aren't working very well, we can find them and rework them with the therapeutic process. There's also the portal effect, which is the wow, that was incredible effect. It's a bit like climbing Mount Everest or graduating from university. It's a huge sense of accomplishment and achievement and transition. And that is really useful in the treatment of many things. Substance use disorder treatment. Tobacco cessation is just one. Alcoholism is another. Depression treatment. End-of-life anxiety treatment. And then there's the empathogens or entactogens. Empathogens being connection with others, entactogens being connection with self. MDMA, MDA, 3-MMC are examples. And what they offer is an intense bonding, a connection with others. And as many of us know, is the alliance between the therapist and the subject or client or patient is the greatest predictor of success in many treatments. These are alliance-building medications. They also help to reflect on self. They also reduce fear. If PTSD treatment, if post-traumatic stress disorder is a tape loop that's buried in our unconscious minds. And it's encrusted with fear. As traditional therapies get close to that tape loop, there's a huge fear response. It becomes very difficult to work with. So MDMA reduces that fear and allows people to go find that tape loop that is so destructive to their lives and actually rework it. And then there's the other psychedelics, the grab bag of everything else. Things like ibogaine, ketamine, 2CB, salvia divinorum. And they're useful for a whole variety of different things, from detox services, things like opiate withdrawals, to addiction treatment, to treatment for depression. So I'd like to reflect briefly on the research I'm most involved with, which is MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD. And it started with Michael Mithofer's work, where he demonstrated a level of effectiveness for treating PTSD which was unparalleled. Now, I went to the CIMVR conference, which is the Canadian Military Health Conference, and it was in Vancouver, and I wandered around for 5 days and listened to people who were essentially pitching PTSD treatments to the military. And even the people who were pitching the treatments claimed at best a 25% level of effectiveness.
but I haven't measured them yet,
The literature says closer to 10%.
so I have them done.
And it takes years, and the dropout rate is high because people don't want to experience their trauma again. It's called flooding or prolonged exposure. to sit a war vet in his trauma again and again and again, hoping that he will desensitize, is really difficult to go through. It's a challenging process. So Michael Mithofer demonstrated in his first round of research an 83% level of effectiveness. He went from 10 to 25%, that window, to 83. Now, if you're a researcher and you're looking at somebody who's offering a treatment as an alternative to another treatment and is jumping from 25 to 83, you are going to say something very simple. You're going to say, they're lying. So to prove that Michael was not lying, what MAPS and MAPS Canada has had to do is to demonstrate what Michael and Annie did with a larger group of therapists with a huge amount of external observation. So in the United States, it's the FDA. In Canada, it's Health Canada. And we have completed our stage 2 clinical trial, and I'd like to share the data with you. This is the comparator dose, 23%. Here is the 2-month follow-up after 2 sessions dose, which is 55%. Here's the 2-month follow-up with 3 sessions, which is 61%. And all subjects on long-term follow-up with many therapists in many countries demonstrated a 67% level of effectiveness. It's starting to look like they weren't falsifying their data. So I'd like to just kind of walk around the academic research just a little bit, some of the studies that have kind of caught my attention. So here was a study by Dos Santos, the antidepressive, anxiolytic, and anti-addictive effects of ayahuasca, psilocybin, and LSD, a systematic review of clinical trials published in the last 25 years. He attempted to make a definitive statement about psychedelic research. And what he concluded is, it looks very promising. We need to do more research. We need to pursue this. There are huge opportunities here for us. I'd like to give a nod to Robin Carhart-Harris with this particular paper. So psilocybin with psychological support for treatment-resistant depression, not any depression, treatment-resistant depression, an open-label feasibility study. Thank you, Robin. Another one that caught my interest, when I finished my last career working in the addiction services, we had a tobacco cessation clinic that was part of our facility. And I was acutely aware that tobacco cessation, and we had great therapists. We really did. We had state-of-the-art. The woman that was running it was highly skilled. And she was knowledgeable, skilled, and passionate about the work. I couldn't imagine anybody more suitable for doing that work. And to be honest with you, she wasn't very effective. So here's a study by Johnson et al. And it was a small N, it was a small number of people, but they took 15 people. Of the 15 people, 12 people, 80% were abstinent from tobacco at the end of it. I've never seen anything with that level of success for tobacco cessation treatments. Here's psilocybin-assisted treatment for alcohol dependence, a proof of concept study. Alcoholism treatment is back. Now, one of the greatest predictors of success with the research with psilocybin is the amount that people have a mystical experience. The degree of mystical experience is often highly correlated with the success of the outcomes. The people who have the most mystical experience have the greatest treatment positive effects. So it's interesting when Griffiths and his crew decided to try and measure mysticism. Now, how do you measure mysticism? I mean, that's a huge challenge, and they did. Oceanic boundlessness on a scale between 1 and 10. The noetic quality, that belief that you've contacted truth on a scale between 1 and 10. The ineffability of it. Can you find words? No. On a scale between 1 and 10. So Griffiths gave people a high dose of psilocybin, and then he went back 14 months later and he asked them some questions. Now, I'm going to apologize in advance for the next slide I'm about to show you. It is slide from hell. And it's what you're not supposed to do in a PowerPoint presentation. It really is. So, apologies. But the numbers are so compelling, I have to show you. So, if you look at the columns on your right, the most distant column is the 14th month follow-up. The column immediately to the left of that column is the 30 milligram dosage at the time of treatment. So if you notice, things like positive attitudes towards life, positive attitudes towards self, positive mood changes, increased sense of spirituality, and how personally meaningful and how personally spiritual this experience was for you. When they asked those questions, 14 months later, what they found is the numbers went up. Now, can you think of any intervention that any psychologist, psychiatrist, or doctor does to anybody that you wait 14 months and then you remeasure and the number goes up? That's an amazing study in what they found. Now, here's another one that kind of just I found so intriguing, because personality is something that is understood to be unchanging. If you look at the study of personality, there are various attributes of personality, and they don't change. That's why psychiatrists and psychologists really struggle with treating personality disorders, because they're generally seen as being untreatable. So anything that changes an attribute of personality is virtually unheard of. And here was an experience with psilocybin that changed the personality domain of openness. And if I think about the relevance of that for so many of the people that I've worked with over the years, things like with addiction services, when you're dealing with people who are firmly in a very fixed belief system that's usually problematic for them, the problem is a lack of openness. So I think this particular study may have legs and go all over the place. Now this next one I'm going to show you, essentially, because I love the title. The efficacy, tolerability, and safety of serotonergic psychedelics for the management of mood, anxiety, and substance use disorders, a systematic review of systematic reviews. You just gotta love it. I hope the researcher that wrote this just smiled when he came up with that title. It's a definitive statement. And it again, Dos Santos again says, psychedelics are something we really need to take seriously. Now, most psychedelic work, most psychedelic research is about what happens in very tightly controlled clinical settings. In very carefully managed situations where people are carefully screened and set up for the experience, and it's beautifully structured. So it's interesting to look at what happens in the community. And there's been two really interesting pieces of research. One looking at recidivism. What are the chances of somebody's going to go back to jail after they've been in jail? And then the variables that influence recidivism. And what we all know is that stable family housing and employment are protective factors for recidivism. People tend to go to jail less if they have stable family housing and employment. But curious enough, use of psychedelics is a greater protective factor than stable family, housing, and employment. And that was a study that had 25,000. It was the criminal justice system records that Hendricks found and went and reviewed them and came up with that statement. He was so intrigued with that, he went into the National Health Survey database and he found 190,000 records. And he looked at psychological distress and suicidality. And what he found was that the use of psychedelics is protective against psychological distress and suicidality. So why do researchers work with psilocybin? Well, essentially, it's less politically charged than LSD, and it's perceived as being easier to obtain regulatory approval, and it's shorter acting than LSD. And at the end of the day, the therapists do have to go home to their families. I want to show you an image, and the image is based on Petrie et al.'s data, and this was the research that he did. He took David Nutt's data. David Nutt is a researcher in the UK who does fMRI research. And then he gave his data to this research group, and they came up with this image. And this is a very common image. How many of you have seen this image before? Yeah, it's very common, so I just want to kind of play with it a little bit. Because the image on the left, the circle on the left, is the human brain under normal conditions, and the different colored parts are the parts of the human brain. So let's say the purple at the top is the visual cortex. What you notice is the visual cortex talks a lot to the visual cortex and not a lot to the other parts of the brain. Under the influence of psilocybin, connectivity, connections are dramatically increased. Different parts of the brain start talking and communicating with different parts of the brain. So psychedelics are all about connections, and I think this really starts to explain some of the positive things that we are seeing in the research. So psychedelics are all about connections. Here is a session that we set up for the camera. The theoretical male therapist on the left is holding the patient's hand. The huge amount of connectivity that happens during psychedelic therapy is something that therapists have to be trained to do and to work with it appropriately, because physical touch happens, and doing it appropriately and doing appropriate connections is one of the arts of psychedelic psychotherapy. And doing it skillfully in a way that works is difficult and requires challenge. So psychedelics are all about connections. Connection to self, connection to meaning and purpose to life, connection to society, to community, to cultural and spiritual beliefs, connection to family, connections to friends, connections to community. I'd like to reflect on the role that psychedelics are taking in terms of the larger drug policy reform agenda. Because you might have noticed cannabis is slowly, in the United States and Canada, becoming legalized. Cannabis became legalized because it got turned into a medicine in the public eye. And then popular opinion shifted because it was seen as a medicine, and the changes that we've seen are happening because of that. There is a public health crisis happening. In Vancouver, there was 1,000 deaths last year. This year it looks like we're going to have 1,500. It is a public health crisis of outrageous proportions. And when I'm asked to talk about it in the media, I say this is not a fentanyl problem, this is a drug prohibition problem. It's prohibition that is killing people. And psychedelics are being legalized through stage 1, 2, and 3 clinical trials. So they're actually being turned into medicines. And through that process and the public media attention to it, public opinion is shifting, and that allows people like Tom and Sherry to step up on the podium and say, hey, we need to harness public opinion and turn it into something else. That's the vehicle for drug policy reform with psychedelics. So I'd like to look at the future of how I believe psychedelics should be regulated. So it's written in a paper, you can go find it, I'll send it to you if you want. So essentially, myself and Brian Emerson, so Brian Emerson works with the Medical Health Officer Council of British Columbia, the voice of public health of British Columbia, and Ken Tupper, at this point in his history, he was a Ministry of Health bureaucrat. And so the three of us got together and said, let's articulate a post-prohibition model for the regulation and control of psychedelics. This is what it looks like. So what we said is, psychedelics, essentially, all drugs, have potential for harm. Every drug. There's no such thing as a drug that doesn't have potential for harm. And the harms can be lumped into different categories. Impurities, toxicity, addiction, and behavior. So impurities won't be a problem in a post-legalization world because manufacturers will make them with known dosages and no purity problems. There isn't a big problem with toxicity. Psychedelic drugs tend to be non-toxic. In fact, Albert Hofmann argued, who invented LSD, argued that LSD was less toxic than water. You can take 1,000 dosages of LSD and survive. It's not recommended, but you'll survive. What's a dosage of water? Maybe a glass? If you drink 1,000 glasses of water, it will kill you. So one can argue that it's less toxic than water. I worked in the addiction services for 28 years, and nobody ever walked in my office saying, I can't stop taking LSD or mushrooms. It just never happened. So there's virtually zero dependency potential. So all of the problems with psychedelics come down to one thing, which is lack of supervision. And so in the model that we would like to recommend, we would have licensed psychedelic supervisors. They would be a professional body. like the College of Physicians and Surgeons of British Columbia or the College of Pharmacists. They would adhere to best practices that were developed by their profession. They would establish, monitor, and enforce standards. And they could have specialties. In the same way that physicians can be dermatologists or psychiatrists, this professional body could also have specialties. You could have a specialty in PTSD treatment. You could have a specialty in ayahuasca ceremonies. You could have a specialty in management of multi-day music festivals, or you could provide group experiences that were paid for. It's a paid professional service. You can ask for remuneration for your services. These folks would be responsible. They'd be responsible to screen and to involve participants in dosage decisions and preventing driving under the influence, and they would be responsible for managing set, which is expectation, setting, which is the environment, for 8 hours after ingestion of the psychedelic. And they'd have to agree to work with other members of their profession to develop best practices and to train people. Now, the most difficult paragraph that we wrote in the paper was access to youth, because we went back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And eventually, we came up with a statement. But I want to talk about the path that we worked with to get there. We started by going into the indigenous literature. And we said, how do psychedelics work in indigenous communities? And we looked, for example, with the ayahuasca communities. And what we found is that there was no age barrier. Pregnant women show up. Women who are breastfeeding show up. Women with toddlers show up. There's simply no issue with age. It's done in family context, whatever that looks like. With the peyote communities, it's a little different. It's about transition to puberty. At that point, the young folks are brought into the teepee and they are engaged in a process of turning into men and women. We then looked at the number of states. We couldn't find Canadian data, but we found a number of states that allow legally adults to supervise alcohol use with their children around the dinner table. Can an adult give a youth a glass of wine? Well, actually, that is legal in many states. So parental supervision is an attribute of this. We then looked at how youth access health care in our province, and essentially we have legislation that talks about a mature minor. If a young person is mature enough to know what they're asking for, the physician can provide the service. It's not an absolute age. If they're too young, if they're in the mother's hands, they're too young to make a thoughtful, educated decision about what they're asking for. It is the parent's choice. If they're mature enough to know what it is they're asking for, the physician can provide the service. So we took all of that knowledge and we put it together and we said, yes, young folks should be able to access psychedelic experiences. And they should be able to access them if they are mature enough to know what they're asking for. It's not about absolute ages. And they would be encouraged to have their parents involved with the process because it's wonderful for family bonding. And if they want to receive the service, they can, but it must be under a licensed, credentialed specialist who provides the services for youth. So what we're actually talking about is providing this kind of certificate to a whole variety of different people who would be licensed psychedelic supervisors. And at the end of the day, what we are planning on doing is opening facilities that look like this. And if you're saying to yourself, that looks way too urban for me, we will also open facilities that look like this. One does not discover new lands without consenting to lose sight of the shore for a long time. The saddest aspect of life now is that science gathers knowledge faster than society gathers wisdom. Thank you.